The village woke each morning to the sound of pestles striking mortars and goats calling out for their young. Red dust rose with every footstep and settled gently on roofs, clothes, and memories. In this place, nothing stayed hidden for long. Love was not only felt, it was seen, measured, and spoken about at the wells and under the mango trees. Elders believed that what began in secret would end in shame, so relationships grew under many eyes. A woman passing with her water pot could feel judgment in the air, not cruel, but watchful. Here, promises were remembered longer than faces, and every union carried the weight of the whole community. She was raised by women who believed love should be held like water, steady, careful, never wasted in anger. Her mother used to say, "Fire burns the hands that carry it. Water cools and lasts." From a young age, she learned patience before desire, dignity before pride. When others shouted, she listened. When others rushed, she waited. She believed loyalty was not loud, but strong. Even when her heart felt heavy, she carried it quietly, the way women before her had done. At night, she would sit by the doorway, watching the moon, telling herself that good things came to those who endured with grace. He arrived in rooms like sunlight through an open door. People noticed him before he spoke. His smile disarmed elders and impressed the young men who wished to be him. He was ambitious, always talking about tomorrow, about building something bigger than the village. Women whispered his name with admiration, men spoke of his confidence with envy. When he greeted elders, he bent just enough to show respect. When he laughed, it sounded like certainty. Many said, "That one will go far." And because the village admired him, they trusted him. When their paths joined, it felt like rain falling at the right season. They spoke of small dreams at first, work, a home, a future shaped by effort and faith. He told her, "I want a life that stands firm." She replied softly, "I want peace inside that life." They walked side by side through the market, sharing roasted groundnuts, laughing without fear. She believed the ancestors were smiling. He believed he had found someone who steadied him. The village nodded in approval, saying the match made sense. Hope settled between them like a blessing. Soon, their love became a story others told with pride. Women praised her patience. Men praised his success. "You are lucky," friends told her. "Hold him well." Elders smiled when they passed, seeing in them a picture of order and promise. But behind closed doors, small cracks began to whisper. He came home later than usual. His answers grew shorter. When she asked gently, he brushed it away. "Work is heavy," he said. She chose peace over questions. In public, their smiles stayed bright. In private, silence began to sit where words once lived. She told herself this was normal, that love was tested quietly before it grew strong. Yet sometimes, when the night was too still, her heart stirred with a feeling she could not name. In that community, a woman's strength was praised most when it was quiet. Elders often said, "A calabash that holds water must not crack from noise." From childhood, she had heard the same lesson dressed in different words: endure, forgive, remain calm. When trouble came, fingers did not point outward, they pointed gently toward the woman. "Be patient," her aunt whispered one evening while braiding her hair. "Men stumble, but homes must stand." She nodded, even when the weight pressed deep into her chest. Peace, she was taught, was carried on a woman's back like a sleeping child, heavy, but never dropped. Around her, people spoke his name with pride, as if goodness followed him like a shadow. At gatherings, friends clapped his shoulder and said, "This one is solid." Relatives smiled at her and added, "You are blessed." Not all women are chosen by such men. Once, when doubt tried to rise in her voice, an older woman laughed softly. "If this man is not good, then who is?" The words wrapped around her thoughts, tightening her trust and loosening her questions. She began to believe that if everyone saw light in him, then darkness must be her own fear. So she gave, not loudly, but fully. She set aside chances that would have taken her far from him. When work called her elsewhere, she stayed. When pride asked her to speak, she swallowed it. She woke earlier to prepare his meals, slept later waiting for his return. When money was short, she adjusted without complaint. "Love is not counted," her mother once said. She repeated that lesson like a prayer. Each sacrifice felt small on its own, but together they formed a quiet offering laid at the feet of the relationship. She told herself that endurance was proof of devotion. Still, small shadows began to stretch across her days. He guarded his phone like a secret charm. When she entered the room, his laughter would pause, then return thinner than before. Some nights, he did not come home until the moon stood high. "The road delayed me," he would say, avoiding her eyes. She nodded, though her heart leaned forward, listening. These moments had no clear names, no sharp edges, only a feeling like dust in the throat. Easy to swallow. Easy to excuse. She reminded herself that suspicion could poison even clean water. When questions rose, she pushed them down gently. She chose peace the way one chooses shade on a hot day. Once she asked softly, "Are you tired of us?" He smiled quickly. "Why would you ask such a thing?" Shame touched her face, and she withdrew. "Forgive me," she said. "I worry too much." That night, she lay awake, telling her heart to be still. She believed patience could protect love, that silence could heal cracks before they broke wide. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, carrying stories she was not yet ready to hear. The house grew quieter, but the silence did not rest. It pressed against her ears and settled in her chest. Even when he sat beside her, something felt absent, like a drum that had lost its rhythm. She would watch him eat, laugh, speak, and feel as though she was standing at the edge of a river whose current had changed overnight. Nothing had happened she could point to. No proof. No harsh words. Yet her spirit stirred uneasily. Old women used to say that when the air grows heavy without rain, a storm is learning your name. She slept, but her dreams no longer answered her gently. The first sound came not as thunder, but as a whisper. It arrived wrapped in care, carried by a woman who did not meet her eyes. "My sister," the voice said softly, "guard your heart." Another day, a friend paused mid-sentence when she approached, then smiled too quickly. Laughter bent away from her path. At the well, she caught a sideways glance, then silence. No one spoke clearly, but the warning moved like smoke, thin, sharp, impossible to hold. That night, she asked the darkness, "What is being hidden from me?" The darkness did not answer, but it did not leave. Truth came without ceremony. Not shouted. Not announced. It struck her quietly, like a small stone thrown straight into the chest. A name slipped out during careless talk. A place mentioned where he had sworn he never went. When she followed the thread, it led her to a moment she could not untie. He had been with another woman. Once. Just once, he said later. Her hands trembled, but her heart did not break all at once. Shock filled her first, then disbelief. People lie, she told herself. Even facts can lie. Hope clung to her like a thin cloth against cold night air, weak, but still there. When she asked him, he smiled as though smoothing troubled water. "You listen too much," he said. "Small talk grows teeth." His words folded easily, like dry leaves under a careless step. One moment he denied it fully. The next, he admitted only what could not be hidden. "It meant nothing," he said. "You know me." Each sentence shifted shape, protecting his image while leaving her unsure of her own thoughts. "Why doubt me?" he asked gently. She lowered her eyes, wondering when truth had begun to feel like disobedience. The woman behind the first shadow did not arrive with drama. She was ordinary, familiar, someone who laughed too loudly when he passed. When they finally crossed paths, the other woman's eyes held pride, not shame. This was not love, it was hunger fed by attention. Ego had called, and he had answered. Seeing her, the truth hardened. It was no longer a rumor with soft edges. It was a face, a presence, something that had stepped into her life without asking. She turned away slowly, knowing this was only the beginning. In the distance, the drumbeat changed again, deeper now, warning that more was coming. She gathered her hope the way one gathers cracked calabashes, carefully, afraid they might shatter in the hands. She told herself it was a single wrong step, not a journey. "Even the straight path has stones," she whispered at night. Endurance, she believed, was strength. Confrontation felt like fire, and she had been taught to carry water, not sparks. When he apologized softly, she nodded. When he promised change, She listened. Her heart was wounded, yes, but still breathing. In the old sayings, hope is stubborn, it refuses burial even when injured. So she chose patience, believing time would wash the stain clean. The next truth did not arrive as a confession. It slipped out during ordinary talk, as careless as spilled grain. A name rose in laughter. A memory did not match the story she had been given. Someone said, "You remember when he stayed late?" and stopped mid-sentence. Her chest tightened. When she asked him later, he sighed, tired, almost annoyed. "I was lonely," he said. "You were always busy." Boredom, he explained, had knocked, and he had opened the door. Emotional neglect became his excuse, laid at her feet like a debt she did not owe. The wound reopened, deeper this time. Outside their home, laughter followed him like a drumbeat. Men clapped his back. Women praised his charm. "You are lucky," they told her, smiling. Inside, silence bruised her more than words. She swallowed questions. She folded her pain small. At night, she faced the wall while he slept easily. In public, his image shone brighter. In private, she carried the weight alone. The elders used to say that some houses glow outside but leak inside. She learned this truth with her own skin, absorbing shame quietly, like earth drinking bitter rain. Then power entered the story, wearing confidence like a crown. A third woman appeared, tied to influence, to favors whispered behind doors. Soon after came a fourth, drawn by status and control. These were not moments of weakness, they were choices made from a place of advantage. He spoke less of love and more of entitlement. "People expect things from me," he said. "You wouldn't understand." Each new truth stood taller than the last, casting longer shadows. She saw clearly now, this betrayal fed on power, not affection. And power, once tasted, rarely asks permission. Around her, the circle tightened. Friends grew distant. Conversations ended when she approached. Advice came wrapped in judgment. "Endure," they said. "Do not embarrass him." Support thinned into silence. She felt watched, weighed, measured, and found wanting. Isolation settled like dust on her shoulders. Yet within that quiet, something began to shift. Pain sharpened her sight. She stopped begging for understanding and started listening to her own breath. The night did not end here, but dawn had begun to prepare itself, slowly, patiently, beyond the horizon. She felt the eyes everywhere, like the wind pressing against the leaves of a quiet forest. Fingers pointed in hidden ways, whispers curled around corners, and smiles held questions. "Why do you stay?" they seemed to ask, not aloud, but in every glance. Her loyalty was admired by no one now. Instead, it was measured, judged, and weighed. She heard the murmurs behind her back. Perhaps she didn't teach him enough. Perhaps she did not keep him satisfied. Each suggestion carved a small hollow in her heart, yet she remained. To leave felt like abandoning the story she had written with her own hands. To stay felt like enduring the storm that raged quietly above her head. The first rumor had been a pebble. Now the truth arrived like stones thrown in succession, knocking the air from her lungs. One name, two names, three, each revelation heavier than the last. She counted carefully. Each new woman was a mirror of his failings, each secret another weight pressed on her chest. She held her dignity like water in a clay pot, fragile, knowing one misstep could shatter it. The walls of her home no longer felt safe. Even the sun seemed to cast judgment in the shadows. Her silence became a shield, her endurance a weapon, though unseen, against the rising tide of disgrace. 8 women in total, and with each, a new wound. One sought his ego, another sought escape from her own boredom, a third measured power in his shadow, and a fourth traded affection for validation. She saw the faces in her mind as clearly as the market on market day, each representing selfishness, each a fracture in a trust she had built on love and hope. Her heart ached, her eyes burned, but she breathed, remembering the old proverb, "Even the river that is troubled must flow." She kept moving, kept living, while each name rang like a bell tolling in a quiet chapel of betrayal. History, she realized, had fastened her feet to the ground. Shared meals, whispered promises in moonlit rooms, sacrifices given with open hands, all bound her to the life she had known. Leaving was not a simple step, it was tearing the roots from the soil that had nourished her. Every memory reminded her of a choice made, a trust extended, a dream shared. And yet, each memory now carried the sting of deceit. Her past weighed as heavily as her present, and she moved carefully, like a woman walking a path strewn with sharp stones, careful not to bleed where others could see. And still, he walked among them, untouched by consequence. Respect followed him like a loyal dog, obedience and admiration echoing where judgment should have taken root. The elders nodded to him in greeting, neighbors smiled and clapped his back. The same society that questioned her presence preserved his image. "He is a man of standing," they said, as though morality could be separated from action. The injustice struck her like a sudden rainstorm, drenching her in cold clarity. She understood now that the world often turns a blind eye to men's sins while counting women's endurance as a flaw. And in that bitter knowledge, she found the quiet strength to keep her head high, even as the wind continued to point its accusing fingers. She moved through her days like a shadow walking behind its own body. Each glance from a neighbor, each whispered judgment, carved a hollow in her chest. Shame clung to her like morning mist over the riverbanks, fear pressed on her shoulders like the weight of uncut stones, and self-blame filled her mind like the dust that gathers in empty courtyards. She spoke little, smiled less, and learned to measure every breath. Her silence became a shield, a fragile wall built from endurance rather than defiance. "If I speak," she thought, "I will break more than myself." So she carried the quiet, the invisible scars, the knowledge that the world was ready to blame her for the storms she had not called forth. At the edge of her life, she paused, looking out over all she had sacrificed. The walls of her home, once warm and familiar, now felt like the bars of a cage. She stood still, though every part of her trembled, the weight of her endurance pressing her down. 1,000 questions screamed inside, yet no sound escaped her lips. Her hands, once full of promise and care, hung empty at her sides. The world had not fallen silent around her, she had. And yet, in that quiet, a strange strength began to form, like roots pushing through hard soil, unseen, unstoppable. Then the truth could no longer hide. Evidence and witnesses emerged, each revelation a strike that shattered denial. He could not twist or minimize this time. The community saw, and the walls he had built for himself began to crumble. Faces once filled with admiration now held sharp calculation. "So this is the man they spoke of," murmured an elder, shaking his head. The whispered rumors solidified into undeniable reality. She did not speak, but her eyes, deep, steady, and unbroken, spoke volumes. The air felt heavier, charged with the weight of justice long delayed. Eyes that once followed him with respect now measured him with caution, suspicion, and quiet disappointment. Doors that had opened with ease before now closed subtly, conversations that paused when he entered lingered after he left. The admiration that had once surrounded him like a cloak now frayed at the edges. He felt it, though he could not name it, a shift in the currents, a subtle turning of the tide that even his charm could not undo. His reputation, built on smiles and words, began to bend under the silent judgment of the people. The weight of 8 lives pressed upon him like the noon sun burning the earth. Each woman, each betrayal, each shattered trust was a stone tied to his back. He could not escape the reckoning, for it moved quietly through the streets, the market, the homes that had once welcomed him. Each act of selfishness, each wound inflicted, became a mirror reflecting the man he had chosen to be. He looked at the woman who had endured, and in her silence, he saw the cost of his arrogance, the measure of the destruction he had sown. For the first time, he understood that some debts are heavier than gold, and some shadows cannot be shaken off. He stood in the center of the room, the sunlight cutting through the wooden shutters and landing across his polished floor, but it offered no warmth. For the first time, he felt the ruin of his own image pressing down, heavier than any public whisper or sideways glance. It was not his reputation in the marketplace, nor the admiration of distant relatives. It was himself, the man he had believed untouchable, now crumbling. Every smile he had worn, every word of charm that opened doors, felt hollow. He murmured under his breath, "Who am I, if they see me this way?" The reflection in the mirror seemed to answer, dark and unforgiving, a man known, yes, but understood at last, for all his flaws. He waited for the expected storm, rehearsed in his mind 1,000 times. Tears, anger, pleading, or the eruption of public disgrace. Perhaps she would yell, perhaps the neighbors would gather, perhaps the elders would intervene. But none of it came. Her face remained calm, steady as the river under a cloudless sky. He took a careful step closer, voice strained. "Surely you will speak, surely you will," but she only looked at him, measured, unwavering. The silence stretched, echoing louder than any accusation. Her quiet became a blade sharper than words. Each moment without a word, each pause in which she did not call him out or demand explanation, cut through the carefully built walls of his pride. He realized that power had shifted subtly, almost invisibly. She no longer sought to persuade, to reconcile, or to soften his guilt. She had reclaimed herself, and in that reclamation, she held the true authority. "You cannot bargain with me," her eyes seemed to say, "because I am no longer here to bargain for." Love, once flowing like a river between them, receded quietly, like a mat being pulled at dawn. The warmth he expected, the shared touch, the whispered forgiveness, the comfort of her presence, was gone. Each absence was a lesson, each withdrawal a consequence. He reached out, seeking the bridge he thought still connected them, and found only empty air. No cry, no plea, no explanation. Only the weight of his choices reflected back at him in the quiet of the room. Control shifted as effortlessly as night replaces day. He had anticipated arguments, defenses, negotiations, but she offered none. She neither justified nor excused, she simply existed, fully herself, untouched by his insistence, untouched by his charm. The world had taught him that power resided in the voice that raised itself above others, yet here, in her stillness, he understood a deeper lesson. Authority could belong to the one who refused to contest it, the one who refused to be moved. Fear crept into him more potent than shame. Losing applause, admiration, or superficial respect had never touched him like this. The fear of losing her, the bond that had once defined belonging, intimacy, and trust, pierced him deeper than any gossip or public scorn. He had built a life counting on the illusion of control, yet now the true loss was not visible to the neighbors. It was quiet, relentless, and unmistakable, the loss of what had truly mattered, the heart of connection that no charm or influence could reclaim. He stood before the crowd, the midday sun sharp on his face, and yet the warmth did not reach him. The whispers of the neighbors, the sideways glances of friends, the half-hidden judgments of relatives, all of it pressed down like the heat of an unyielding desert. But he made a choice no one had expected. He did not speak of excuses, nor offer the empty bargains of charm he had once mastered. Instead, he lifted his voice, steady and unshielded. "I have wronged," he said, letting the words fall like stones into the silent courtyard. "I have betrayed trust, and no story, no explanation, can change that truth. I do not ask for mercy. I do not seek forgiveness. I only offer truth, as it must be told." His hands were empty, his gaze steady, offering nothing but honesty. He stepped away from the offices, the gatherings, the positions of influence that had once cloaked him in protection. Each step was deliberate, each relinquishment a lesson etched for all to see. The mantle of authority that had shielded him from consequence now slipped from his shoulders, and he bore nothing but his own accountability. "I will bear the cost of my choices," he continued quietly, voice firm against the murmurs of the crowd. "I will accept what comes without placing my burden upon another. She deserves no debt of explanation, no repayment of grace. Only truth stands between us now." The onlookers, accustomed to the rituals of male privilege, felt a hush spread like wind over dry grass. They had expected defiance, bargaining, or outrage, but instead they saw accountability that demanded nothing in return. Eyes widened, murmurs faltered, and the usual celebrations of male redemption remained absent. No cheers rose, no voices proclaimed closure. Only the heavy stillness of a truth laid bare, of a man stripped of entitlement and faced with the weight of his own choices. The lesson hung in the air, unshakable. Accountability is rare, justice is quiet, and redemption, if it comes at all, is earned, not demanded. The morning light crept slowly over the rooftops, casting long, pale shadows across the dusty streets. There was no applause, no calls of celebration, only the quiet hum of life resuming after the weight of yesterday. Windows opened reluctantly, neighbors moved through courtyards with cautious steps, and the truth settled into the bones of the town like a heavy, unshakable wind. The spectacle had passed, but reality lingered, unyielding. She rose before the sun, her hands steady despite the ache in her chest. For the first time in many months, she allowed herself to breathe without carrying his sins on her shoulders. She began with small acts, folding her own clothes with care, sweeping the dust from the corners of her home, speaking softly to herself, naming her own strength. Each gesture was a reclaiming of identity, a declaration that she existed not in relation to him, but as a woman whole in her own right. The hushed judgment that had once shielded him now began to unravel. Eyes that had once softened in his presence now measured him differently, as whispers of truth wound through the community. Gossip transformed into reflection, conversations shifting from protection of his image to acknowledgement of reality. The unspoken shield of silence that had kept him untouchable had cracked, and he could no longer hide behind the veil of admiration. Even the elders, who had often murmured advice in private to women who endured, now nodded in quiet understanding. They spoke less of excuses, more of responsibility, and the town began to see the weight of enabling, the cost of turning a blind eye. Compassion grew for her, tempered by the bitter knowledge of betrayal. He walked through the streets carrying nothing but the burden of what he could not undo. There were no shortcuts left, no public image to defend, only the steady, unrelenting lesson of consequence. Each step reminded him of the trust he had shattered, the respect he had lost, and the humility he had never known until it was demanded of him. And as he moved forward, the town watched silently, witnessing the slow, unceremonious work of justice and reflection. The morning carried a stillness that was almost sacred. She stood at the edge of her courtyard, sunlight pooling at her feet, and felt the weight of months of silence lift slightly. Forgiveness did not arrive as a command from the elders, nor as an expectation whispered by the women who had endured before her. It arrived quietly, like a door opening in a wall she had built around her heart, a choice offered, not a demand. She could step through, or she could remain on her own path, and the decision was hers alone. She began to act with intention. Each step she took was measured, deliberate. She swept her home with care, spoke truth to herself, and engaged the community with honesty rather than charm or compromise. Her growth was visible not in reconciliations or reunions, but in her steadiness, the way her presence demanded respect without force. Friends began to see the woman she had always been, not the one defined by his betrayal. Love was no longer something to endure silently. It had changed shape, defined not by sacrifice alone, but by truth, responsibility, and restraint. She realized that love was not measured by suffering or forgiveness alone. It was measured by integrity and the courage to hold one's own heart with dignity. Justice returned gently, not with vengeance, not with applause. The wrongs were acknowledged, consequences lived, and balance settled quietly into the lives of those affected. No victor claimed the day, and yet the order of truth restored a peace that had been absent for too long. Even as years passed and names faded from memory, the lesson endured. Betrayal had consequences, accountability had weight, and change could only come when the ego was set aside. In the echoes of this story, the community carried a truth that would outlast gossip, shame, or fleeting scandal. Actions, not words or promises, define the legacy of a person.